Good morning, everyone, and welcome to SASB's Sector Series webinar. This webinar will be focused on the technology and communication sector. Today, you will be having the Tech and Comms Sector Analyst, Quinn Underriner, who will be speaking to some of the issues occurring within the sector, as well as SASB's current status on its standards and the process moving forward. So I do want to remind everyone that, or let you know that we'll be having a Q&A portion at the end. So please do submit your questions at the panel on the right throughout the webinar. You can send them in at any time, and we will be reserving maybe 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Quinn to begin the webinar.
Great, thank you, Jill. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. So as Jill mentioned, this morning we are going to be giving an overview of SASB's approach to issues, kind of a high-level look at the technology and communications sector and some kind of trends that we are noticing and how they are playing out in the world of sustainability. We're going to kind of talk about some of the changes that are currently being proposed to the technology and communication standards, and then kind of look at a high level as where SASB is going in kind of this whole next stage of our process. So to start, some of you may be familiar with this already, but kind of the real underpinning of the work that SASB does is the U.S. Supreme Court's definition of material information, which as it says, is defined as as information that presents a substantial likelihood that the disclosure of the omitted facts would have been viewed by the reasonable investor as having significantly altered the total mix of information made available. This is kind of like a driving principle in how we approach every single issue and how we vet all of these topics. And again, I'll go into a bit more about how we vet issues moving forward, but something we're very much thinking about is item 303 of Reg FK, which is kind of has as a test for disclosure, this what is called the probability and magnitude test, i.e. the likelihood of something occurring and then the potential financial impact of said event. So only if things kind of like pass a certain threshold, again, looking back to the definition of materiality, would something be needed to be disclosed in the Form 10K. So to kind of start from the bottom of this pyramid and move up to kind of give you an overview of how SASB is approaching these things, we have evidence-based, industry-specific, and market-informed process that is really trying to nail down, as we see these topics, which we see materiality, as we see it play out, is happening at the topic level, which again is seeing on the left side there in purple, and there's perhaps potential to affect value creation is of interest to investors and all these other types of issues. And then on the other side of this, we're looking to select metrics that then can best address this underlying issue that we are likely to see as material. I think it's an interesting but important distinction. Generally, that's something at the metric level would not be considered to be material, but this is at the topics. We are always looking, and as I'll be talking about later in this presentation, we are having a few tweaks as we move from our provisional to our codified standard to really get these metrics, or to have them be as strong as possible so that they represent these material topics. So from there, we want to present this standard so that people have a unified, uniform approach with common definitions to use. For this process, with an end goal, as what we are kind of always aiming for here at SASB, is to have to identify material information that is going to be decision useful for investors and importantly cost effective for companies to disclose. So at a meeting at the top of that pyramid there, we see ourselves very much as a conduit really in between the needs of investors and the needs of companies. So again, the rigor that goes into the selection of these issues means that much in the same way that SASB governs U.S. GAAP and governs the financial information for the Form 10K, SASB is doing the same thing for non-financial accounting metrics, which we see as being integrated into the MD&A and or risk factor or other sections as companies deem them appropriate. And so this can all be funneled in and be of the quality that it can be presented in the Form 10K. So in choosing these issues, just to kind of walk through some of our processes, we look for evidence of interest, which we generally did this. We have an algorithm that we have that scans through whether this is SEC filings, other standalone reports, sustainability reports, consulting reports, all other industry level things to kind of get a sense of, at a high level, what issues are currently being discussed in this space to kind of get down our initial thoughts about what might be an important issue. We then, to assess materiality, both do desk research and outreach to members of to companies and to investors and to people in the people who work in this space to really understand, okay, what issues are there that are important, and then how can we tie this to a financial impact in an important way. And then within our process, which I'm sure some of you on this presentation have participated in, and somewhere or another we had an industry working group which we sent out these initial hypotheses to, and we from them received feedback on whether they believed different aspects of it were material, were the metrics that we had suggested, were they cost effective, were they decision useful. We took that information back, did some more research on our end, then we put up for public comment periods. This is a process that every single one of our standards went through initially, and we'll mirror some elements of this process again as we go to its codification. And then we finally, again, we would look at kind of the landscape and all of the information that's already being presented out there and try to, as much as possible, back out this data. Although, again, as people in this field are well aware, one of the main problems in this space that SASB is addressing is the fact that there is a current lack of data. So to the best that we can, and I'm happy to speak to this in more detail, we try to test the financial materiality of these spaces, and we are confident that we have identified the topics that kind of pass that threshold. And further in that space, something we find quite heartening is that within that kind of broader analysis we did of relevant documents, we found that about 75, we found that in 10Ks, about 75% of the topics that be identified as likely to be material are already being disclosed. So when we are thinking about these issues, again, just to kind of visualize how much we are really pointing towards the financial impact and financial importance in these spaces, we are always trying to figure out how, what would the driver of impact be in that issue, and then exactly how might that show up in financial valuation. Right, so something I will be speaking about in this presentation is, the importance of diverse workforce and technology, thinking, okay, how could this show up? And again, we drill down to this a bit, but at a high level, okay, this has an effect on intangible assets and long-term growth, and this is most in the highest level impact that this is going to show up on revenue, right? And so within each of these issues, we want to be careful, or we are careful as we identify them and include them, that we can kind of draw these straight lines in between the issues, how that impact might manifest, and then exactly where that might show up for an analyst, so that it could be helpful as these analysts prepare DCFs, or as they prepare the work that they would need to kind of, add this into the analysis they're already doing. So just at a high level, what do we mean as we call it the technology communications sector, as we have our own industry classification system we use at SASB called 6, which catalogs industries by their sustainability characteristics and risks, which so it closely mirrors many other classification systems. We do have our differences. So within this sector, we kind of govern the kind of full spread here of the technology pipeline. So starting with EMS, ODM companies, which we define as kind of this pure play manufacturing space, as opposed to hardware companies, which we assume in the way that we draw out our industry do not have their own manufacturing and are simply design, but we'd ask for an integrated company to look at both of those standards. We have semiconductors, which we do assume in the issues that we identified there, that those companies have their own fabs. And then up through the stack there to software and IT services companies, internet media and services companies, and then telecommunications. So to speak about kind of two themes that we have kind of noted in this space and think that are going to be important moving forward is we are looking a lot at data privacy and security. So I'm sure some of you saw in the news this morning, there was Yahoo had another large data breach, actually this time from a 2013 attack, where 1 billion user records were compromised, which is separate from their 2014 attack where they had 500 million users data compromised. And again, so I think as we see, it was often known that there were clashes in between management and some members of their security team, and that some of these issues can kind of repeat themselves when they are not necessarily managed correctly. And these things really can drive value, as this has caused their stock to dip. And I know that investors are really starting to understand that this is something that has both kind of immediate effects on consumer confidence and then has these issues that can kind of play out over the longer term. And that, I think, as the Yahoo case can show us in a certain way, is that certain types of policies and certain there's certain precedent that can be set that makes an attack in the future potentially more likely, and it is that increased, again, probability of such an event that we would want our standards to be able to capture, and we believe that we can help investors identify when those kind of events would occur. And I guess on the other side of this, thinking about data privacy, this is another issue I believe that is going to only grow in importance. I mean, there's no shortage of surveys that are telling you that consumers are becoming more concerned. And I think it's really important to note, because at this point, I think a recent survey from PwC found that internet advertising was about a $60 billion industry last year, and was growing at about 20% year over year. And there have been a lot of benefits, I think, in the tech industry and certainly beyond to this wealth of information that we are now able to gain about consumers and target to consumers. And with the growth, again, of the Internet of Things, it's only going to increase the types and amounts of data that can be collected. But I think one thing that is not being discussed and addressed long enough here is because while people are, I think, very readily can conceptualize sustainability in terms of long-term environmental needs, right? There's a finite resource in, say, water that we need to conserve, and for future uses in manufacturing and other spaces. But I think another thing that is worth considering is that companies collectively I don't believe, while there are some examples of companies who do this well, think about the long-term viability of gaining this data from consumers, and that the fact that consumers are going to increasingly turn to, I mean, Firefox recently had its new version, Firefox Focus, right? We have these kind of privacy enhancing browsers. People are potentially moving more towards encrypted communications and systems that explicitly guarantee their privacy. And I think that this is a movement that if companies don't kind of steward public will and don't really show people, okay, this is how your data is being used and why, I think that public goodwill to kind of make that exchange of data for services in the long term, again, is as a true sustainability risk. And the other kind of high-level issue we want to touch on here, although of course there are many in the technology and communication space, is a diverse workforce. Recently found a study that was saying that there might be as much as 1 million vacancies in computing and internet technology by 2020. And currently American companies are vastly underproducing. There's about a little over 50,000 related graduates each year in this field. But if we were able to reach even gender parity within this space, with only maybe about a third of women coming out of these programs moving into broad IT space, if we were able to reach that parity, this entire issue would go away. And so I think there is something to be said for both this broadly being an industry issue of kind of helping, as yet again, as some companies have certainly begun to think about, solving this pipeline issue and really bringing more women and then more people of broad ethnic backgrounds into this work pipeline could really help ameliorate these issues. Also, as an individual company basis, companies that are seen as being welcoming and recruiting to both to both capture and then retain these employees are likely to see a sizable cost decrease, as they are not having to pay more to attract workers away from these other companies as these shortages continue to tighten and cause problems for companies in this space. On the other side of this issue, one of the other metrics that we look at, apart from looking at diversity, in that way we are also looking at companies' reliance on foreign workers and H-1B, and then we're not saying that use of this as program is in any way bad or good or anything. SASB is value neutral on a lot of these statements, but there is, as we're all aware, a risk in the current political climate, especially if you listen to what Sessions has been saying, has some of Trump's rhetoric around the H-1B program, which currently allows an extra 65,000 workers per year to work in the space, that there might be a significant shrinkage within this program. And so again, there are kind of SASB metrics within this space that are kind of pointing to people's reliance on these workers and allow companies to shed some color on how they might be shifting workers around or what programs they would have to attract and recruit the talent, that in an industry space where much of the value is really in this intangible, it's really wrapped up in human capital, is going to be most important. So now just those are kind of two high-level issues, but to kind of give you an idea of how issues play out in the provisional standards currently in the technology and communication sector. We have, where there is kind of manufacturing issues, we do have some water and waste management, some energy efficiency issues that you might be more used to seeing. But again, what I think is notable, as touched on the last two slides, in the tech space is that we do have, compared to some other SASB industries, more of these kind of broader social issues around diversity and around data privacy and security, as well as intellectual property protection, competitive behavior. And then for some of the companies with longer operations, we have supply chain management and material sourcing as kind of like another key theme in this space. And so the tech industry kind of mirrors the statistic I mentioned earlier that talked about the industry in the whole of, kind of around 75% almost of metrics or of SASB topics are being discussed in some way. Certainly, as you can see on the screen, in some industries more than others. This kind of walks through, and the next slide will give you a concrete example of what some of those disclosure types might look like. But is a given issue, or are these issues not being disclosed? Is there boilerplate disclosure? Is there something a little more specific but not SASB specific metrics? And then you have, of course, the smaller dark gray portion on the right there is SASB specific metrics. But we see this as heartening because, again, it's like companies are identifying these, or we're identifying these same issues that companies are acknowledging are material. What is on the table here and is going to just be not as decision useful for investors. Not as decision useful for investors. So all we need to do is, but as we see, is we're just moving the needle from these lower quality disclosures to the higher quality disclosure. But again, it's not like we're coming up with a whole new set of systems that are not currently being discussed, that are not currently being worked through. So kind of take a deeper dive into the provisional standards. Something I do like to note is, so while we have, and I'm assuming many of you on this cast have taken a look through our standards, many people do not actually know that all of these standards have companion pieces in the research briefs, which not only do these kind of give a sense of the makeup of the industry and the regulatory climate, admittedly at the time when these briefs were written, which they are currently being revamped at the moment. But they also, within each issue, kind of nail down our thinking of the scope of the issue, evidence for that materiality, evidence of materiality of that issue. We have in a section on how that might show up in financial valuation. And then we also have some of these charts, which I have an excerpt from on the screen now, that kind of walks through at a high level some of the information that we had before us as we were kind of like making these determinations, which they can be useful to look through these documents. And I'm actually often surprised how many people have seen the standards but have actually weren't aware that there was a companion piece that was worth examining. Sure, to kind of give you, so in the back of these briefs, we'll have these charts that would look at, on that first column there is the heat map score, which again these are not perfect proxies in any way for certain type of interest, but this is how we were kind of scanning the world of related documents in this space to kind of see how often was this issue currently being discussed. And then after that, we have our industry working group, which again was kind of our first response to issues that we had put on the table of what percentage of people in that space, which we tried to pull an equal mix of companies, investors, and then other stakeholders as lawyers, accountants, consultants, etc. So they would list how many of them thought it was likely to be material, percentage of that, and then having what priority they listed that issue as being. And then, again, while we kind of nail this down a little more in a value impact section of this chart, in the brief itself, in this kind of summary chart at the end, we want to list, like, okay, like, it's going to show up as a revenue cost type impact. It's going to affect assets and liabilities, cost of capital. And are we seeing kind of evidence of interest? That's the EI dark gray column there from its continued mentions in investor, in sell-side reports, in other investor news related, and other related investor news, and what is the strength that we think in the magnitude of that financial impact, which is going to be that other column on the right. So just to kind of drill in a little more into the tech space. So again, to look at, take for an example, the semiconductor industry, I think we're seeing this kind of, again, this kind of same trend. I mean, it does vary quite a bit by issue, the quality of disclosure. But broadly, there are some kind of more targeted metrics like being disclosed. And broadly, again, even though there's so much boilerplate, as we're seeing, that kind of like light pink, it still means that there's not a single one of these issues that isn't being discussed to a degree by companies already. And what we mean by boilerplate is to look at this. These are both real disclosures. And so this would be moving from something where companies are acknowledging, okay, so failure to comply with applicable environmental laws and regulations could have a material effect on our business, which is great as an investor. You do want to kind of know what areas to be paying attention to. But you really might want to see, again, if you're looking at this, or something around conflict minerals, you'd want to see the exact number. So in 2015, 83% of the smelters used in our supply chain were validated as conflict-free. So kind of being able to take those data points and use them, investors will use them to kind of measure progress year over year and benchmark companies against each other, as well as companies can use that information internally as something else that we want to really draw home, and companies can then see if this data was published across and allowed for this type of comparison. You know, do they have a competitive advantage in some of these spaces? You know, really, where do they need some work, and where is that value really being left on the table? So I think kind of even those internal checks, as we have found in speaking to companies, can also actually be a very beneficial part of this process. You know, and then also companies can see, I mean, companies that are currently handling these issues very well have a lot to gain, potentially, because some of these issues currently, as they are rather opaque, many investors are probably just giving a higher cost of capital across the board for some of these issues that they can't really nail down and understand, and that companies that aren't conveying to investors and to the right groups of people like how well they're performing on those issues are in many ways simply leaving money on the table. But again, we have this kind of whole problem of without that data being out there, it's really hard to see, you know, where this is occurring. So I'm going to kind of walk through at a high level what we're calling our hypothesis for change. So as we have these provisional standards on the table, we are now currently going to be working through to provide codified standards. So I'll pull up a timeline in a little bit, but what we are looking at now is we are right now starting to ramp up collecting feedback on anything that people want to comment on any of the standards. Certainly we welcome feedback on any elements of our work, but we have kind of a document that's kind of pointing to a couple high-level changes that we are suggesting be made, which I'm going to kind of walk through a few of here. And then we also, in this document, have an appendix that kind of details minor technical changes, which we don't think warrant major comments, but again, companies are certainly, we certainly would love to have companies to weigh in and investors to weigh in on this part of the process. So we're going to be kind of collecting this data and this information between now and March 31st. And on that date, we're going to kind of present a final form of some of these findings for a 3-month public comment period over this summer, with an idea of having a finalized codified standard coming out in Q3 of 2017 that will be then usable for companies to put information into their 10K. So to walk through kind of two of the high-level things that we are suggesting. So for the Internet Media and Services industry, and also actually the same proposal is being made in the software and IT services space, as they both have these data center efficiency related issues. We are looking at the inclusion of additional metrics, because as of now we have only kind of metrics around total energy use and total water use, and there do exist specific metrics to the data center space. So by our suggestion here, we are merely trying to put something on the table of like, we know that the Green Grid put out a new set of standards that really captures that there is currently a complex trade-off in between kind of energy usage and cost efficiency and system resiliency. And so we know that the Green Grid has recently put out a new set of metrics that is attempting to capture that within that space, and so we want companies to kind of weigh it. So we know this is a new metric, it's new in the space. Would this be something that would be useful to ask companies to disclose and benchmark across companies? And so we would love to hear feedback on that, as we are trying to really see, okay, can we nail down even more specifically what types of trade-offs companies might be trying to make in this space, so that investors can get a full picture of how companies are managing this very large cost center. Because as it says there, the oft-quoted statistic is that data centers in total use about 2% of all of the electricity in the United States. This is no insignificant amount of cost for these companies. But again, when we propose these types of things, if there are people online who believe that there is a better measure that could be used across these spaces, that is what we want to hear. We're not, with these types of things, attempting to prescribe anything to any company. We just want to put on some proposals that we're saying, okay, we saw that in our earlier phases, people really acknowledged this was a difficult issue to measure, and we kind of want it to have another shot on the table and really shine a light on that of like, okay, so maybe help us then look at what do companies and what do investors believe could be the best measure within that space. And moving on, we have another proposal in semiconductors for the addition of a product security related topic. And we were kind of looking to this as the rapid growth in the Internet of Things, which is going to account for about, I think about a little over 30% of semiconductor growth in the next couple of years. This is a major driver, is also very much going to be tied to the ability of these companies to provide security for those softwares. A recent HP report found that about 70% of the most common Internet of Things devices contain security vulnerabilities, and there's an increasing awareness and sophistication on the part of hackers, where we're seeing this move from being what might have been even a decade ago thought of much more of a strictly software type related issue, as these are also showing up in as a concern for semiconductors. We're starting to see companies advertise the level of security they are providing. But as you can see there, even, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security even recently suggested that it would be standard practice for these security measures to be put in at the design phase for these companies. What we are looking at is, so I think while both in the semiconductor space, and we have kind of a similar suggestion of a metric within the hardware space, as it already has a product security issue, but to kind of add another type of metric is kind of looking at perhaps standardizing or what standard companies are looking to, because as we are aware, ISO and IEE, as well as the FTC and NIST, there are kind of all of these both governmental and non-governmental organizations that are attempting to provide kind of a standardization for security in this space, but there seems to lack a current common consensus. But again, the companies that are going to gain market share, really kind of ride this growing wave, are going to need to prove that their devices are secure in many ways. And so this is going to be an important differentiator for companies in this space, but currently investors have very little lens into which companies are managing this risk well, and which company is at risk of, say, having some of their products, in the case of hardware, be a part of a large-scale botnet attack and face recalls, as we saw happen recently. So what's next for SASB? So we are going to be kind of moving around. We're looking at moving around the structure of our organization, kind of subject to some finalization, but we're going to have the standard setting organization kind of separated from the rest of the organization and overseen by a independent standards council, which we are going to name the members of soon, that is going to be in charge of agenda setting, process and control review, and have the ultimate say in standards approval. And they're going to be appointed by the Standards Oversight Committee, which is going to be a subset of some SASB board members. So it really is, some of you might recognize, kind of mirroring in many ways the structure of SASB, and really attempting to have as independent and rigorous of a process and of a structure as we can to really show the markets that there is independence in this space, and that this structure wouldn't allow for any sort of capture by companies or regulators or anyone else in that space. So as I mentioned, again, I would really like to ask people on this call to then participate in this next phase of deep consultation that we have going, as we said. So within the next couple months, we would ask companies to provide comments, and we will soon be publishing the hypothesis for change, but I'm also happy on an individual level as we reach out to people to send these out. And then also we would love feedback on, again, any element you think that we can make in the standard to be more cost effective or to be more decision useful for companies involved. And then separately over the summer, so from April and then 3 months onward, as we have this public comment period, we would urge people to participate and give us feedback as we have finished this march towards codification. So something that we wanted to announce is that SASB, as some of you might have seen, has created what we call our investor advisory group, and we recently added some new members of it, kind of closing our first set of founding members of this group, which include many of the largest asset owners, including Vanguard, CalPERS, CalSTRS, BlackRock, State Street, and many others. And members of this group have kind of seen that there is a real value in sustainability data, and that there is a current lack of a way to get this data and integrate it into their evaluations. And they agree that SASB's approach that is focused on materiality and decision usefulness is the right type of approach. And they agreed to have members of their team start to ask companies for this information to be given to them and to participate in this process. And so we are very excited to have some such luminaries in this space working with us to put forth this method, or put forth this need to get sustainability data fully on the table. SASB also has a group of advisory partners that provide different services within this space, but that are there for companies who want to start to understand how they can integrate SASB into their internal processes, what internal controls maybe need to be in place. And so for companies, we do have people that we can hand them off to begin this process and who are familiar with the work that SASB does. And also SASB itself has many other publications and things that can be useful for companies. We do have on our website an implementation guide that speaks about at a high level, okay, who in a company's organization needs to be involved, kind of how might companies go about this initial materiality assessment to figure out which of these topics that their company needs to disclose. As I mentioned, we do have research briefs. We have technical bulletins that kind of outline in many ways like where in the case of companies that might split across many industries for, say, how they should report. And we also have an FSA certificate, which is the kind of fundamentals of sustainability accounting, and it really is for people who want to understand how financial information can affect value. And it's this two-part test that we provide, and we are happy to send along information related to that for people who really want to delve into this world and have kind of a professional development angle to it. But so, yeah, thank you all very much. I'm happy to take any questions about this new phase that SASB is embarking on. I'm personally very excited to kind of like move from these provisional standards to this codified set. And again, as I've said many times, really just want to reiterate, SASB is here not to command that certain things be made. We are not trying to make new regulations. We are really here to provide, to really be this centerpiece between investors and companies. So we want to hear from you about what is going to be the most decision useful, what is going to be the most cost effective for companies. Thank you very much for joining me this morning.
All right, thank you so much, Quinn, for that great overview. As Quinn just mentioned, we're going to start the Q&A now. We already have a couple questions that have come in, but please do feel free to submit them throughout over the next 10 minutes or so. So one question we've received is, how are companies in the manufacturing space reacting to or addressing the data privacy and security trend?
So that's a great question, and I think, so as I mentioned, these kind of like dovetailing issues that we are presenting in our next hypothesis for change document is really asking for both semiconductor and kind of hardware design companies potentially to discuss how they are addressing those issues. And to your point, so that is the real difficulty, is to really understand what companies are doing in this space is hard. So there are these kind of independent, these kind of the other certifications that companies can look to, although again there's not like quite an industry standard, but companies can discuss the security that they put in the design phase of this processes. But currently the data to understand how that works is limited. Admittedly, we very much know that there has to be a balance. Companies can't provide a detailed blueprint on what they're doing because that of course defeats the purpose. But currently it is pretty hard for companies to differentiate themselves within this space without this kind of standardized way of assessing, how seriously companies are addressing that within their work. But I think more and more you're going to see industry leaders differentiate themselves by looking to some type of, say, third-party certification in that space, or by following say, what ends up being the ISO standard or something equivalent in that area. And yeah, it's certainly something I think people are realizing more and more, that there is a risk that has not been fully addressed in the past and is currently being exploited, by hackers.
Okay, great. Another question we have, given the fast-moving and ever-evolving nature of the technology sector, how can the standards continue to stay relevant?
Sure. So just to kind of touch on the next part of this process, so after these standards are codified in Q3 of next year, it's not like we just drop them at that point. There will continue to be a dedicated SASB sector analyst in this space whose job it is to follow changing regulations, changing industry trends, and the standards are going to be regularly updated, probably about every 3 years, looking about after that. But we're going to make sure that as these kind of emerging issues come in, that SASB standards can change as there's a new industry standard around a certain issue, that those things can be updated. So this isn't something that's just dropped on the table and that we walk away from.
Okay, great. Another question we have. The OTI are developing standards for reporting on privacy issues. Is SASB utilizing their output in any way?
Yeah, so we have actually spoken to some people there. I mean, again, so they are the kind of reports that they are looking at kind of have a broader audience, I would say. And so the trick, the struggle within that is that we need to take what they're looking at, which is a pretty thorough output, and we need to roll it up into something that both is truthful to privacy issues, but again, gives it, so it's a relatively compacted enough amount of information that investors can use it. in a way that they can place this into their evaluations. It doesn't require, okay, you need to read, this entire report, which again, some people working in policy, and maybe even some investors, specifically do care about that, but just on an average space, we have kind of this issue around brevity and kind of like minimal set of viable standards that we are trying to hit. Personally, I think that they're doing great work. We certainly look to some of their stuff and be happy to receive comments about how our current data privacy metrics could be updated. But again, we really need to walk that line of how much information we can ask for in the 10K, and then frankly how much information investors would want, or how much detail investors would want around that.
Very quick question. Someone just wanted a clarification. Does OTI stand for Open Technology Institute?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Another question we have is asking about the relationship of SASB to GRI. So if you could just explain a little bit about how those two organizations relate.
Absolutely. Sure. So the way we see it is that SASB exists kind of with a laser focus on the capital markets. We are looking at a pretty narrow subset of stakeholders relatively, in that we're looking at the investment community and what type of data they need. This, in many ways, so to speak about it broadly, the work at SASB does not in any way invalidate the need for standalone sustainability reports. Because these reports, well, of course, some of them are being used by investors. These reports have a much broader group of stakeholders that they are addressing, right? They're addressing customers, they're addressing employees at those companies. And so there's a much broader group of issues that generally are going to want to be addressed by those groups. So GRI and SASB in that way really can exist perfectly in harmony, as GRI provides this kind of framework for these sustainability reports, which are still very necessary within that space, and SASB kind of has this investment lens. So I think that it's not that one invalidates the need for the other. I think that these both really just have different end goals in mind.
Okay, excellent. Another question we have. As an ESG analyst, I'm often asked if ESG ratings are forward or backwards looking. How do you answer this question for fundamental analysis?
Sure. Yes, I mean, I think looking with many SASB metrics, we do try to think about that, and as much as possible, we want to capture kind of forward-looking risks, right? And I think in many ways that is what we would think about, say, in diversity, right? Again, as I mentioned, as I was talking about earlier, in some of those trends, we are looking at, okay, so how well you currently can attract a kind of diverse workforce in a field where human capital is so important, is in the future going to likely reduce your costs, as you don't have to pay extra basically to lure other people as there's a shortage of workers. So I think that there are some of these issues that kind of look at these really systemic long-term risks. And again, I think that you're right, there is of course going to be some stuff that can be backwards looking within this, but as much as possible we would really argue that, or I would personally argue that sustainability is really looking at what companies are managing their assets, in the broadest sense, for the long term. And so I think, again, that kind of is an inherent future lens to it.
Okay, great. Someone is asking a question about SASB standards in the international context. They're curious about SASB maybe being adopted by non-US regulators. So can you speak just a bit about SASB's application globally? Yeah.
So we've been approached by people in quite a lot of countries actually, really looking to see how this might apply in their space. So while we'd say, so the current SASB focus is, really just on U.S. capital markets, and we're governed again by U.S. Supreme Court definition of materiality and the kind of the laws here. That isn't to say, though, that it's not unlikely that these standards also then apply or could apply in other markets. I mean, again, many companies listed on U.S. exchanges are global companies, and that is something we certainly keep in. We don't pretend that companies reporting through SASB are only have their operations in the U.S. There certainly is a global focus to it. I can't say that in the short term SASB is going to be aggressively pursuing those other markets, but certainly I don't see it as impossible in kind of the longer term to have that happen. And I certainly believe that our standards are broadly applicable, broadly applicable globally.
Okay, great. Someone has asked a question, it's kind of broad, but can you shed some light on the impact of the recent U.S. election on SASB's work?
Sure. So the way that we see it at SASB is that we've never really looked for, say, like an SEC mandate for our work to continue. Because again, I think that could be the concern of, we're about to see a pretty large political shift in the way the SEC is run. But we kind of see that our work has been always outside of that, as we like to say, for the market, by the market. And that really, as as I pointed out earlier, we have these kind of large institutional investors on our institutional advisory group who are pushing for this information. More and more companies are internally tracking this information and trying to figure out ways to publish it, because all of them are really noticing that this is what drives value. And I don't really think the political climate will change that. So we're really going to see, or we believe that we will see adoption happen kind of through those mechanisms, much more so than, we were never asking for new regulation or new anything like that. So, well, of course, this might change how certain issues play out. As I mentioned, again, this might change the number of H-1Bs available. There are all these other different ways in climate regulation some of the stuff might play out. But in all honesty, a lot of the stuff is already in motion. And I don't really see it fundamentally altering SASB's plan in the short, medium, or long term.
Excellent. All right, well, we've gone about 3 minutes over our intended time, and there's a couple questions that we did not get to speak to, but I do encourage everyone to submit any other questions that you may have to Quinn. You can see his email address right there on the slide. You can also find it on the SASB website. He's happy to answer any questions that you have or set up time to schedule a consultation. Just a note that we will be sending out a recording of this webinar to all registrants, so that'll be coming your way in the next day or two. Thank you so much to Quinn for this excellent analysis and overview, and thank you to everyone for showing up. Have a lovely day.